native Irish speakers on native Irish islands. Various visitors also provided enormously entertaining and illuminating accounts of their visits to the islands. In the Public Record Office in Northern Ireland, there is a diary from 1895 by Nora Workman, who was part of an antiquarian group. This really is the era, the late 19th century, of these antiquarian cruises, as they were called. It's a 29-page diary in which she describes a trip around the Isles of the West. And she remarked in her diary in relation to these islands of the West, "What a strange lot to live in these bare, bleak places." She was warned when they stepped ashore on Inishmurray not to interfere with the ancient stones, because some previous visitors had interfered with the ancient stones to their considerable personal cost. She was also part of a wider interest in antiquarians and ethnographers and anthropologists who were making these pilgrimages to the island in the second half of the 19th century. Some resented that the islanders were being depicted as living museum pieces. Individuals like Robert Lloyd Prager and A.C. Haddon were very interested in the origins of the island people. And A.C. Haddon was also a thief. He stole 13 crania from Inishboffin, for example, and was absolutely shameless about it. Another individual, Charles Brown, who was a GP and an anthropologist, was involved in a remarkable survey, the Irish Ethnographic Survey, which ran from 1891 to 1903 to try and document the islands and island life in great detail. And again, they provided us with an enormous amount of material about the islanders themselves, how they lived and how they were struggling to cope with modernity as it arrived in the early 20th century. There were also, of course, very famous literary visitors to the islands, including J.M. Synge, the great playwright who arrived on the Aran Islands in 1898. The very first night he was there, his notebooks are in Trinity College, Dublin. He recorded in his diary as he was lying on the cliff above the sea, "Before long I shall know every secret of the sea." As he was to discover, you can never know every secret of the sea, but he was imbued with this great sense of optimism at that time, his first visit, and he went on to document the islanders, of course, in great detail, and his book on the Aran Islands became renowned. But you can see in the private correspondence in his archive that the poet John Masefield was worried about Aran Island, about the book on the Aran Islands, because it was so good. He suggested it will send scores of tweeded beasts to the island. He was worried about what tourism might do and the inquisitive spirit might do to the way of life of the islands. And it's an important theme. Of course, Synge was particularly preoccupied with the exquisite purity of intonation when it came to the way Irish was spoken on the island. And he did justice to a lot of different aspects of island living. But there were those who felt that there was an unreal idealism entering accounts of island life and the island people. Liam O'Flaherty was very caustic about this. You had to cut through the rhapsodies and the pieties, he insisted. There are too many writers trying to persuade us that the island people are babbling children of God, innocent of all ambition and ignorant of all guile. And he was writing in that thunderous way in the 1920s. So it's very revealing, I suppose, about some of the tensions that could be generated around the idea of an unrealistic expectation of island life. And of course, those who only travelled there in the summer would have got a very different picture than if they had been there in the winter. There were also religious visitors to the island, separate from the parish priests, which I found in the Capuchin archive in Dublin, because they were asked by the Catholic hierarchy in the early 20th century to preach a national temperance mission. And some decided that the islands needed a visit. And we have the account of Father Brennan, who was sent to Achill, and he was asked to sum up his visit to Achill Island on this temperance mission to persuade them to give up the demon drink. His summary was, "Ochone, Ochone, the memory of it is enough to make one either laugh or weep. The people are moral," he said, "but absolutely indifferent, if not worse." Another well-known visitor, of course, was Robert Flaherty, who came to the Aran Islands and ultimately made the film Man of Iron, which was released in 1934. Robert Flaherty was determined to keep the modern world out of the picture in this extraordinary documentary. What Tim Robinson was later to suggest, the great chronicler of the Aran Islands, was that the life it recreated was still too salt in the memory for nostalgia, and the simplicity it heroised were seen as brands of poverty. And there was an element of truth in that. Of course, it was an enormous opportunity for some of the islanders to get involved in the filmmaking process. But even the most dramatic scene in that film, the shark hunt, was about recreating a way of life that didn't exist on the Aran Islands anymore. And that was the way Robert Flaherty worked. And he also took extraordinary risks with the lives of some of the islanders in order to document the dangers of island life. Another extraordinary visitor to the islands was Antonin Artaud, who was the creator of the French theatre of the absurd in the 1920s and the 1930s. Clearly disturbed, or what the islanders would have referred to gently as a din and a dia. He arrived in 1937 and ended up on the Aran Islands. He also left without paying his debt for lodgings. And he had the Can de St. Patrick. He had St. Patrick's cane, as far as he was concerned, and he insisted that it needed to be returned to its original source. One of the reasons why he was on the Aran Islands at that stage. He eventually ended up in Dublin, and he had to be taken in, eventually arrested and deported as a result of being found destitute and raving in Dublin. Another interesting visitor was Theodore Roth, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and author who arrived in Inishbofin in July 1960 with his horrified wife Beatrice, who did not approve and certainly was not dressed for island living. She was wearing her city clothes as she boarded the boat of one Richard Murphy, the recently departed writer and poet Richard Murphy, who seems to have been keen to court Theodore Roth in order to get a publisher for one of his books. Now, there was a different response from different islanders on Inishbofin to the arrival of Theodore Roth. He was certainly welcomed in Milo's bar on the grounds that the barman would not have to listen to the same fishermen talk about their tales of woe or tell their stories of maritime woe, the same stories he'd heard night after night. Here was someone who was different, who was flush with both drink and money, but things got completely out of hand on Inishbofin because of his addiction to whiskey. He eventually ended up in St. Bridget's asylum in Ballinasloe, having been committed as a result of his particularly egregious behaviour on Inishbofin. There were other visitors, sociologists, who certainly were not as objectionable in their behaviour when it came to the abuse of drink, but perhaps they were objectionable in another way. John Messenger, for example, arrived from the University of Indiana to what he termed Inishbeog. To you and I, that was Inish Ear, and he eventually published his book Inishbeog, as if that would suggest that people wouldn't know the true identity of the island. He was particularly preoccupied with what he regarded as the Jansenism of the islanders, their denial of sexuality, the extent to which they were oppressed. They were hypochondriacal, they were depressed and masochistic, as he wrote about in various parts of that book. And he was the yank in the corner. As the great journalist Michael Viney, of course, has a particular interest in the islands and is up in Taliban. He had a particular interest in characterising those who were coming over with their notebooks to do what they called, or what Messenger called, conversation monitoring, which to you and I is eavesdropping. And there was a suggestion that the islanders were very wise to him and perhaps were feeding him some choice lines which found their way into the book. There were others who wanted to travel to the islands, of course, as an antidote to modernity. You can see this particularly in the late 1960s, where some writers from abroad discovered that the stoical lives of the islanders were chasing them into a different way of living, and that they would remember what was important in life. But these visitors continued to cause tension. Deborah Hall was another very interesting visitor to the island of the White Cow, Inishbofin, and she published a book about this in the 1980s based on her visits there in the 1970s. She spent a few years on the island with her partner. And there was a snobbery and a virtuosity to this book which irritated many. As she put it herself, I feel righteous in contributing to the island's survival. But she depicted island bitchiness as an art form. Past lives, as she saw it, were being perpetually retold. And there was a prurient interest that she had in the lives and even the physical details of the islanders, which made for very uncomfortable reading, though she was a talented writer, I think. In contrast, Tim Robinson arrived to the Aran Islands in 1972, and he wanted to unpack, in his own words, the immensities in which these little places are wrapped. What a beautiful phrase. And it's typical of Tim Robinson that he approached it like that. He wrote about the islands like a gifted novelist. And there's almost a religious fervour in the way that he celebrates the earth of the islands. Though he was an atheist, as he pointed out himself, I trust prayer no more than whiskey. But he did certainly believe that it wasn't enough, in his own words, to fill a diary of intoxication. And that's not what he did. He sought to try and unwrap the place in terms of the history and the place names, and really contributed enormous amounts to the understanding of the islanders. And how else could we understand the islanders? What did island life mean to the islanders at various stages? I mentioned Charles Brown visiting Western Islands in the late 19th century. As he saw, they were honest, thriftless. Some of them, their habits in relation to hygiene left a lot to be desired, but they were robust. These were healthy populations. A lot of them experienced poverty and instability, but overall his depiction of the islanders was very positive. And you can see this in some of the baseline reports in relation to the islanders. There's no single island experience, of course. A lot of people were concerned about the decline of the kelp industry, which had been such an important part of the island economies for so long. And you can still see that in the baseline reports in the 1890s. But there were difficulties in sustaining that. You can also see individual islanders who are corresponding with officialdom about the private lives of the islanders. James Ward, for example, on Tory Island, who wrote a lot about the need to close down the pub. He suggested that the islanders were pugnacious, quarrelsome and boisterous in drink, as if that only applied to the islanders. But he also wrote about the need to close the pub on a Sunday and to get the islanders to take the pledge. Though, as he admitted in his correspondence with Patrick O'Donnell, the Catholic Archbishop of Raphoe, at Christmas 1912, I cheated myself by putting some Hennessy on my plum pudding. But sure, that was no harm. You can also get accounts in these baseline reports of the Congested District Board inspectors of the conditions of the houses. The way Townsend Gahan, one of the inspectors, put it in the 1890s in relation to islands on the west, their general condition was more prosperous than many on the mainland. He highlighted Clare Island also in relation to this. They were very well clad, well dressed, but also had very good houses. What they had lost, he suggested, were habits of industry and self-reliance. There was also much observation on Inishbofin and the importance of its curing station, which of course did not last in relation to fishing, and again the loss of the mackerel. You also have native islanders who developed their own indigenous industries, particular illegal distillation of poachine. And there was a verse associated with Inishmurray, and the Inishmurray Islanders were renowned for their poachine. We have kept our own distillery, no taxes do we pay. May the Lord protect my island home that lies in Sligo Bay. And it made a very important contribution to the island economy. And they had all sorts of ways of signalling between island and mainland in relation to potential visits from the law. Though that island, of course, as I mentioned earlier on, was evacuated in 1948. What you can never get away from in relation to the islanders and island living is the sea. It was the most savage force in the life of the islanders. It always has been, always will be. It was unrelenting and unforgiving, as well as being beguiling and so beautiful and capturing so many imaginations. But when you consider what happens when things go wrong, Have a look at Synge's play Riders to the Sea. What does Kathleen say, the character in that? It's pitiful what's left over when a strong rower and fisherman perishes. A bit of old shirt and a plain stocking. And later the poet Seamus Heaney was very captivated also by the Aran Islands. And he wondered in his poem Lovers on Aran, did sea define the land or land the sea? And that remained an enigma. When you consider the bearing it has on the characters of the islanders. And Liam O'Flaherty also wrote very powerfully about that. It was something that did have a very strong bearing on their characters, on so much else. There were also the difficulties associated with trying to make a living for those who did survive in fishing. The memoirs of a Cape Clear fisherman, Micheál O'Dálaigh, who fished between the two world wars. We were often, he wrote, for fluck, imneach, uchroch, onroch. And even for those of you like myself whose Irish is not as good as it should be, he's not suggesting fishing was a bed of roses. He's talking about the anxiety, about being miserable, about being wet, about being hungry. But that is only part of the story. There's also the exceptional skill associated with island seafaring and fishing off the islands. The idea that Aran boatmen needed to keep the tongue in the centre of their mouth when they were in a curragh. Such was the delicacy and the skill that was involved in that particular way of travelling in the sea. There were also an awful lot of different traditions and superstitions associated with the sea that we can see in the Irish Folklore Commission, because an awful lot of work was done from the 1930s to collect the stories and the folklore of the islands by these commissioners, who went out to the islands and talked to the islanders, unlike some who wrote about them. The sea must have its share was a theme that constantly came up when the commissioners were talking to the island people. Some believed it was unlucky to save a corpse from the sea because they would come looking for more. Whistling on board was taboo because of the fear that you might whip up the sea. You get all sorts of different superstitions around the sea and fishing in particular. You also get a stoicism that is necessary, that is crucial. But what's becoming more and more apparent from the 1940s, as reports compiled by the government were concerned, was the everlasting terror when the men are at sea. And that was a line taken directly from Women on the Blasket Islands in 1947, the difficulty of trying to sustain that way of life. Were islanders particularly fractious? That's another theme that emerges. There were certainly a number of legal disputes that arose out of difficult relationships, shall we say, on the Aran Islands in particular, between the Flahertys and the O'Donnells. I also found an amusing account of a court case relating to Dursey Island in Cork in 1939, when Dennis Healy, who was at the centre of this particular case, denied that he got the name the Slasher because he was fond of fighting. And you'll appreciate that the judge in question did not accept his denial in relation to that name, the Slasher. But the islanders spent more time amusing themselves. Some of them were absolutely brilliant musicians. They organised cake dances, which are recorded in the Irish Folklore Commission. Wakes were a very important island occasion, and they did them in considerable style. You also have an awful lot of information on the women and the work that they were doing, and the amount of island work that they were doing, particularly when the men were at sea. A lot of visitors were enthralled by the Achill Island women and the way they were able to manage their ponies coming down very steep hills. And all the hard labour, of course, that was involved in that kind of work. There's also the question then, though, of whether or not there is going to be a desire on the part of the next generation to continue island living. If you consider attitudes to marrying on the island, or indeed marrying into the island. You can see this in Padder O'Donnell's novel Islanders that was published in 1925. One of the characters' Ruth's desire to embrace the idea of island living in the West. But the way Charlie, the object of her affection, and the islander puts it, would she starve on the island like my mother? And it's a typical bleak line from Padder O'Donnell in relation to the reality. There was also the memoirs of B.N. Hederman, who was a Jubilee nurse who was posted to the Aran Islands in the early 20th century. And she wrote a caustic memoir about the fatalism of the islanders and the barbarism of some of their cures. She was aghast in particular at a tradition which was saliva for a newborn baby, the spitting on a newborn baby as a gesture of congratulations and good luck. The extent to which the hair of a dog, not what we understand by the hair of a dog, but the actual hair of a dog was used to rub in to wounds in order to supposedly heal them. And she also again had criticisms to make about excessive drinking. But there was one particular islander took issue with her chastisement in relation to this, and the way he put it was, if Solon and all the preachers had to live long enough in Aran, they'd want a pint too. But many visitors also recorded, of course, the importance of house visits, the importance of storytelling, the scoriacht, playing football on beaches. Richard Power wrote a wonderful book that was translated as Apple on the Treetop about his experiences on the Aran Islands. And he was talking about these stories that were being told by the island storytellers that could go on night after night. And when one particular listener discovers that the whole story is a complete lie, as is revealed at the end of it, the response of the storyteller was, "Didn't it put down a few evenings?" And that, of course, was very true. Now we know, of course, that some of the accounts of island life were parodied by Flann O'Brien, Miles Nagopaleen. He wanted, as he put it in a letter to the playwright Sean O'Casey, to get under the skin of a type of gale I find the most nauseating in Europe. Now this has been misrepresented. Flann O'Brien did not think Tomás of Critton's Island Man, for example, as a book was a bad book. Far from it. He found much of value in it. What he took issue with was the translation of island books in the Irish language into the English language, because they lost all of their nuance, and they lost their originality, and they lost their power. And the way he put it, of course, was that the Irish language amounted to a spectrum of graduated ambiguity. And there's certainly a lot of truth in that. When you have these literal translations, they don't, of course, carry the power of the original text. Others were interested in the sex lives of the islanders. I mentioned Robin Fox earlier on, who spent time on Tory Island. What intrigued him was that of 51 married couples on Tory Island, 10 were not cohabiting, a very high proportion. This did seem to have something to do with trying to keep the original nuclear family intact. But he did ask some of the islanders what about carnal relations in relation to these island couples that were not living together. And the response he got was, well, there's always the fields. And who wants to be spending a long time at it anyway? And Fox recorded these very straight observations into his sociological analysis. They were coming up with their own solutions to these particular issues. Now, in relation to how